Your team just rejected a genuinely good idea, and the only reason was who made it, not the cost, not the quality, just the source. That reaction has a name. It is called not invented here syndrome, and once you learn to see it, you will notice it everywhere in your own organization. Here is what it looks like on the ground. An engineer spends 3 weeks rebuilding a tool that already exists, off the shelf, tested, ready to use. A manager hears about a competitor's process improvement and waves it off as not how we do things. A department gets solid research handed to them by the team down the hall and quietly shelves it. None of these people think of themselves as irrational. Every one of them can explain, calmly and confidently, why the outside idea just would not have worked. That confidence is the tell. It is not evidence. It is the syndrome talking. Notice the language people use when the syndrome is running the meeting. That won't work for us. We're different. Let's just build our own. It'll be cleaner. Every one of those phrases sounds like a technical judgment. Almost none of them are actually backed by a technical comparison. Nobody pulled up the competitor's tool and ran it side by side against the internal option on cost, speed, or quality. The rejection happened before the evaluation did, and the evaluation, if it happens at all, gets built backward to justify the decision that already got made in someone's gut. That is the real signature of not invented here syndrome. Confident rejection, with no real comparison underneath it. The obvious explanation is that these people are just stubborn, or not smart enough to recognize a good idea. That explanation is comforting, and it is wrong. Not invented here syndrome is not a competence problem, it is an identity problem. Somewhere along the way, a team starts tying its self-worth to being the source of good ideas, being the team that solves things, being the smart ones. Once that identity is in place, an external solution stops looking like a gift. It starts looking like a threat. Accepting it means admitting someone else got there first. And for a team whose whole sense of value is, we are the ones who figure things out, that admission feels almost physically uncomfortable. So the brain does what brains do with uncomfortable facts. It finds reasons to reject them instead of sitting with them. This is worth slowing down on, because it explains why smart people fall for it just as hard as anyone else, maybe harder. A junior employee with nothing to prove can shrug and say, "Sure, let's use that, it's good." A senior team with years of accumulated expertise has something to protect. The more skilled and respected a group is, the more its identity is wrapped up in being the source of solutions, and the more an outside idea feels like a quiet accusation that the emperor has no clothes. Expertise, instead of making people more open to good ideas from anywhere, can make them more defensive about ideas from outside their own walls. That is the uncomfortable part. Nobody likes to say out loud in a performance review. Researchers who study R and AMP, D departments, have looked directly at this pattern, and the finding is almost funny if you are not the one running the team. Groups that scored high on not invented here bias consistently underperformed groups that stayed open to outside input. Consistently. Not occasionally, not under specific conditions. And here is the part that should really bother any manager reading this. The biased teams often had stronger individual talent, better resumes, better credentials, more raw horsepower per person, and they still lost, on average, to teams that were willing to borrow. Think about what that actually means. Talent did not disappear inside those high NIH teams. It got bottlenecked. A brilliant engineer who refuses to use anything they did not personally build is not operating at full capacity, no matter how good they are, because they are re-deriving solved problems instead of building on top of them. Almost all real innovation is recombination. Someone takes an idea from one place, a method from another, and a technology from a third, and puts them together in a way nobody had tried yet. Teams that wall themselves off from outside ideas are voluntarily cutting themselves out of most of the available raw material. They are trying to invent using only what is already in the room, while everyone else gets to draw from the whole building. There is also a quieter economic mechanism sitting underneath all of this, and it is worth naming because it is not really about ego at all. It is about sunk cost. A team that has already spent months building its own internal version of something has real money and real hours buried in that decision. Admitting an outside tool is better does not just bruise the ego, it forces the team to confront that some of those already spent hours were, in hindsight, wasted. People will go to remarkable lengths to avoid that admission, even when the smarter move going forward is obvious to everyone standing outside the situation. That is the same loss aversion instinct that makes people hold onto a bad stock instead of selling it, applied to a team's own labor instead of its own money. Picture a sports franchise instead of an office for a moment, because the exact same pattern shows up there in a cleaner, more visible form. The general managers who build lasting winning teams are rarely the ones who insist every player has to be homegrown. They trade constantly. They sign free agents from rival programs. They study what winning teams elsewhere are doing schematically and adapt it without embarrassment. The front offices that quietly decline year after year tend to be the ones most attached to our system and our way of developing talent, even after the losses pile up and the evidence says the system needs outside input. Fans rarely notice the difference in real time because both franchises talk about pride and identity using almost identical language. Only the standings tell you which kind of pride was actually helping. Now for the case study that made this idea famous, because it is almost too clean to be real. Except it happened exactly this way. In the 1970s, Xerox built a research lab called Park and told its scientists to think years ahead of the market. Those scientists delivered. Inside Park, researchers built a working graphical user interface with windows, icons, and a mouse years before ordinary computer users had ever seen anything like it. This was not a rough sketch. It was a working demonstration of the future of computing, sitting inside a company whose entire business was photocopiers and printers, and Xerox largely let it sit there. The technology did not come out of the printing and copying business that defined the company's identity and paid its bills, so it never got the internal backing it needed to become a real Xerox product. It was treated as a curiosity from the research wing rather than the future of the entire industry, which is exactly what it was. Other companies did not have that blind spot, because they had not built the thing themselves and had no ego invested in dismissing it. Apple's engineers saw a demonstration of the Park interface and immediately understood what they were looking at. Microsoft was not far behind. Both companies built empires on an interface pioneered inside a photocopier company that could not bring itself to take its own invention seriously, because it had come from the wrong part of the org chart. Here is my honest take on why that story is the interesting part, more than the invention itself. It is not really a story about a missed opportunity. Companies miss opportunities constantly. That alone would not make Xerox Park a business school case study 40 years later. What makes it genuinely strange is that Xerox did not fail to invent the future. It succeeded at inventing the future, on its own payroll, inside its own building, with its own scientists. Then it dismissed its own creation for the exact same reason other companies dismiss outside ideas, because it did not fit the identity the company had already decided it had. Not invented here syndrome does not require the idea to come from a stranger. It just requires the idea to come from outside whatever internal group currently controls status and resources. Xerox Park proves that a company can reject its own best idea using the exact same psychological machinery it would use to reject a rival's idea. The wall is not really about geography. It is about identity and control. So the syndrome scales with company size and structure. But here is the part nobody expects. It also scales with something much smaller and much more personal, which is simply time. The syndrome gets worse the longer a team has been together. That is not intuitive. You would think a mature, experienced team, one that has worked out its rhythms and built real trust, would be more secure, and therefore more open to outside input, not less. The opposite tends to happen. The longer a group works together, the more of its own identity gets built into its own methods. The way we do the handoff, the way we structure the sprint, the way we write the proposal. Those habits stop being neutral tools and start being part of the group's self-concept, the same way a favorite tool starts to feel like an extension of your own hand the longer you use it. Suggest replacing it even with something objectively better, and it does not register as a helpful suggestion. It registers as an attack on the hand. This is the same mechanism that produces groupthink in long-tenured teams generally. just aimed at outside ideas specifically instead of outside opinions. A team that has been together for years develops shared shortcuts, shared jokes, a shared sense of how we do this, and all of that cohesion, which is genuinely valuable for coordination and trust, comes with a side effect. It raises the emotional cost of admitting that an outsider might know something the group does not. New teams do not have that sunk cost yet. They have not spent years building an identity around their own current methods, so a better outside idea is just a better idea, not a threat to years of accumulated self-image. And the syndrome does not stay contained inside one team's head. It spreads through leadership, and this is the mechanism every manager reading this should sit with the longest, because it is the one lever they personally control. Employees are constantly, unconsciously, watching what their leaders reward and what their leaders dismiss. If a manager visibly waves off an outside idea, even in a small offhand comment in a meeting, the team absorbs the lesson instantly. Outside ideas are not to be taken seriously here. That lesson does not need to be said twice. People are extremely good at pattern matching what gets rewarded in a room, and a manager's body language during a 5-second dismissal teaches the whole team more than any values statement on the wall ever will. A leader who wants an open team has to actually visibly reward outside adoption, out loud, in front of people, because the alternative signal travels faster and sticks harder. This is also why the syndrome is so hard to kill once it takes root in a team's culture. It is not one decision you can reverse with one memo. It is hundreds of tiny signals, repeated over months, each one small enough to seem unimportant on its own. A raised eyebrow at a competitor's name in a planning meeting, a joke about another department's methods, a slightly longer pause before saying "interesting" to an outside proposal than before saying it to an internal one. None of those moments feel like a decision at the time. Added together, they are the entire culture, and by the time the pattern is obvious enough to name out loud, it has usually been running quietly for years. It helps to think about this the way you would think about a professional kitchen instead of an office, because the dynamics are identical and somehow easier to see clearly from the outside. A head chef who refuses to use a technique because a rival restaurant invented it is not protecting quality. They are protecting ego, and their food gets worse for it while they tell themselves a story about integrity. The chefs who actually rise, the ones who build reputations that last, are famous for stealing shamelessly. A trick from a French kitchen, a method from a street vendor, a plating idea from a competitor's menu, folded in without a second thought, because the only question that matters to them is whether the dish is better. Nobody eating the food cares who invented the technique. They care whether it works. Your customers, and for that matter, your own executives, are in exactly the same position as that diner. Nobody upstream is grading your team on where the idea originated. They are grading the output. So what actually fixes this, given that you cannot just announce "stop being defensive" and expect it to work, because nobody consciously experiences themselves as being defensive in the moment? The fix is deceptively simple, and it is simple on purpose. Because complicated fixes require willpower, and willpower runs out by Thursday afternoon. The fix is not banning internal pride. Do not tell your team to stop caring about their own ideas. That pride is often exactly what drives them to build good things in the first place, and killing it would cost you more than the syndrome does. Instead, build one habit. Before anyone on the team rejects an outside idea, competitor process, another department's research, a tool that already exists, force one question onto the table first. Does this actually solve the problem? Regardless of who made it. Just that. Say it out loud if you have to, every single time, until it becomes reflexive instead of optional. That one question works because it does an end run around the identity trap instead of trying to argue with it directly. It does not ask anyone to feel less proud of their own work. It does not ask anyone to admit the outside idea is better in some abstract, humiliating way. It just redirects the conversation toward the only variable that was ever supposed to matter, which is whether the problem gets solved. Teams that install that filter as a genuine habit, not a poster on the wall but an actual step in how they evaluate options, start behaving differently in a way you can measure. They start borrowing faster than they invent. They start shipping faster than the teams around them that are still quietly protecting their own turf and calling it standards. If you manage a team, here is the concrete version of this you can put in place this week. Add the filter question as a literal, explicit step in whatever process your team uses to evaluate a new tool, process, or proposal, so it is not left to memory or mood. Put it on the template for the proposal document itself, not just in your head, so it survives even when you are not personally in the room. And separately, start treating "we adopted someone else's idea, and it worked" as something worth celebrating in front of the team with the same energy you would use for an original invention, because right now, in most organizations, only the inventing gets applause and the borrowing gets treated as a quiet admission of defeat. Reverse that, even in small ways, in your next team meeting, and you will change what your team reaches for the next time a good idea shows up wearing someone else's name. One more practical lever worth using deliberately: rotate people across teams or departments on a regular cadence, even briefly. A person who has spent real time inside another group's way of working comes back with first-hand permission to say, actually, their approach is better here, because they earned the credibility to say it from the inside instead of the outside. That single voice, someone the team already trusts, arguing for an outside idea, does more to break the identity wall than any policy memo ever will, because it is not an outsider making the case anymore. It is one of their own. If that changed how you see your team, follow for more.